The Cold War did not begin with a single shot, nor with a single treaty signed in silence. It was born in whispers, in smoke-filled rooms where generals and politicians debated a world freshly scarred by the Second World War. On one side stood the United States, wielding the language of democracy and capitalism as both shield and sword. On the other, the Soviet Union, draped in the banner of communism, promising a new order for a fractured planet. Between them stretched a fault line that cut through continents, oceans, and even families. And in the cracks of that fault line lurked men and women who thrived in shadows. Spies, double agents, informants who betrayed their own for the promise of ideology, revenge, or simply survival. This is the story of one of them, a man who sat silently at the heart of an empire, carrying secrets in his briefcase and lies on his tongue. He was not a general, nor a president, nor a man of armies. Yet, in the hidden chessboard of the Cold War, his betrayal tilted the balance of power. Some say he shortened the Cold War. Others argue he nearly plunged the world into nuclear fire. One thing is certain: his shadow still lingers over the history of espionage. But before we meet him, before we step into the alleys where dead drops waited, or the safe houses where coded signals flickered through radios, we must step back into the atmosphere that made him possible. By the late 1940s, Europe was a continent of ruins. Berlin, once a beacon of modernity, was now a fractured city, divided into occupation zones patrolled by soldiers who mistrusted even the children playing in rubble-filled streets. The airlift of 1948, when Western planes fed an entire city blockaded by the Soviets, became more than humanitarian aid. It was a declaration. The two superpowers would never truly trust each other. The United States and its allies spoke of freedom, but their definition often meant spheres of influence, secret deals, and military pacts. The Soviet Union thundered about liberation, but behind the curtain lay gulags, surveillance, and the ruthless machinery of the KGB. In this atmosphere of paranoia, spies became the ultimate soldiers. Their weapons were not tanks or missiles, but whispers. Information was the currency of survival, and in that currency, one man would eventually prove to be both invaluable and catastrophic. He was born into a world that already distrusted itself. His youth coincided with the rise of totalitarian regimes and the thunder of World War. He had watched, as a boy, how entire nations could be swallowed by ideology. He saw how loyalty could be demanded at the point of a gun, and how betrayal could mean survival. This man, let us call him, for now, only the asset, was intelligent beyond measure, but he carried within him a coldness. Friends would later describe him as charming, capable of holding a room with quick wit and intellect. But they also noted something unnerving: his ability to detach, to separate his emotions from his actions. It was as though, even in laughter, part of him was standing outside the moment, watching himself perform. When he joined the world of intelligence, it seemed almost natural. The great agencies, MI6, the CIA, the KGB, were hungry for men like him, educated, sharp, fluent in languages, capable of passing in any circle, whether sipping cocktails at a London dinner party or slipping unnoticed through a Moscow side street. And so he entered the world of espionage not as a conscript but as a natural player. He understood that the Cold War was not a war of armies but of appearances. Whoever appeared strong, whoever appeared certain, would hold the upper hand. And appearances could be controlled, distorted, manipulated. The question that haunted historians later was simple. Why? Why would a man sworn to one nation decide to betray it so completely? Was it ideology? Perhaps. The Cold War bred fanatics who truly believed their system would save the world. Some turned against their own governments because they saw corruption, hypocrisy, or brutality. Others did it for money, greed driving them to sell secrets like trinkets in a marketplace. For the asset, it was never just one reason. In truth, it was a cocktail of them all. A sense of superiority, that he was smarter than the very empire he served. A hunger for recognition, even if it came from the shadows. And perhaps, buried deep, a flicker of ideology. A belief that if he played both sides, he could shape the outcome of history. His first betrayal was small, almost insignificant. A name slipped, a location shared. But in espionage, even a single page of the wrong document could unravel entire operations. His handlers were cautious at first, testing him, probing his loyalty. Could he be trusted? Would he fold under pressure? He did not fold. He thrived. By the early 1950s, the asset had secured a position that few spies could dream of. He sat at the nexus of intelligence, close enough to hear the whispers of generals, to glimpse the plans that shaped nuclear strategies, to touch the very pulse of his nation's security. And yet, each night, as he returned to his home, he carried more than papers. He carried the knowledge that what he had seen by day would, by night, become ammunition for the other side. He was not the only spy of his era. The Cold War was littered with traitors, defectors, and agents who vanished behind the Iron Curtain. But what made him dangerous was not just his access, it was his skill. He knew how to package information, how to prioritize what his handlers most needed, and how to disguise his own tracks. In an era when suspicion was everywhere, he seemed the least suspicious of all. Friends described him as loyal, colleagues trusted his judgment, and superiors praised his efficiency. He was the perfect ghost, hiding in plain sight. To understand the weight of his betrayal, you must imagine the Cold War as it truly was, a game of nuclear chicken. Each side hoarded secrets about missile technology, troop movements, diplomatic plans. Even the hint of a new weapon could shift the balance of fear. The asset passed not just documents, but futures. He delivered intelligence that revealed weaknesses, exposed plans, and in some cases, doomed men whose identities were compromised. And yet, his nation never suspected. Not yet, because betrayal, like poison, often takes time to reveal its effects. By the end of Block 1, the audience must feel it. The tightening of the noose, the inevitability of collapse. The man at the center of the story was still seen as a patriot by those who saluted him, as a friend by those who shared drinks with him. But already, the pages of history were shifting. The double life was in motion. The betrayals were deepening. And soon, his name would be whispered in corridors not just as an operative, but as the man who betrayed an empire. And yet, as all great stories of espionage remind us, he was not simply one man. He was the embodiment of a world gone mad with secrecy, paranoia, and the seductive thrill of betrayal. The question is not just how he did it. The real question, the one that still echoes through history, is this: did he betray his country, or did he betray himself first? The answer lies ahead, in alleys where shadows met shadows, and in whispers that could topple governments. Because this was not just a spy. This was the spy who betrayed an empire. The noose had been tightening for months, though perhaps Oleg Penkovsky, whether he admitted it to himself or not, had always known his time as a double agent could only end one way. For years, he had lived on borrowed time, walking the razor's edge between two superpowers, feeding secrets to the West while maintaining his post within the Soviet machine. Each coded message, each late-night drop, each smuggled film reel was a wager against fate. And now, in the spring of 1963, the inevitable had arrived. The KGB had begun to close in. Subtle signs at first, colleagues asking unusual questions, shadows that seemed to follow him longer than coincidence would allow, a sense of eyes always watching. Paranoia was part of the profession, but this was different. Oleg's instincts, honed by years of deception, screamed that the walls were collapsing. The Soviets had finally found their crack in the armor. The trap was elegant in its simplicity. The KGB had grown suspicious of his contacts with foreigners, Western businessmen, diplomats, cultural attaches, and began to monitor him more closely. An intercepted message here, a suspicious rendezvous there. Then came the damning evidence. Surveillance of courier meetings, photographs of clandestine exchanges. A pattern too incriminating to ignore. When the arrest came, it was swift. KGB officers swept into his Moscow apartment, their presence as suffocating as the system they represented. He was taken without a fight because in truth, what fight was left? The man who had outmaneuvered both Washington and Moscow now sat handcuffed in the back of a black Volga, staring at a city he would never walk freely through again. The interrogation was brutal, as much psychological as physical. The Soviets wanted names, networks, proof of who in the West had aided him. Oleg held out, relying on the iron discipline that had carried him through years of duplicity. But even the strongest resolve falters under relentless pressure. In the stark, windowless rooms of the Lubyanka prison, he faced his reckoning. Trial followed swiftly, though it was more theater than justice. In 1963, Penkovsky was brought before a Soviet military tribunal. The outcome was predetermined. His crimes were not only against the state but against the myth of Soviet invulnerability. The authorities needed an example, a warning to anyone who might dare to betray the motherland. Cameras rolled, the press reported every detail, and the spectacle was broadcast to millions. In the courtroom, Oleg sat stiff, his face a mask of defiance and resignation. He admitted to espionage but framed his betrayal as loyalty to humanity rather than to the Soviet system. "I could not stand by," he declared, "and watch men risk the annihilation of the world for their pride." It was a shocking statement, part confession, part manifesto. For the Kremlin, it was intolerable. The sentence was death, whether by bullet or, as some whispers claimed, by more cruel methods, remains debated. Some accounts suggest he was executed swiftly, others that he was cremated alive in a furnace deep within the Lubyanka as a warning to others. The truth is shrouded in secrecy, as much of Penkovsky's life was. But by May 1963, the man who had arguably prevented nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis was gone. For the West, Penkovsky's fall was devastating. He had been one of their most valuable assets, perhaps the most important spy of the Cold War. His intelligence on Soviet missile capabilities had given Kennedy the confidence to call Khrushchev's bluff in 1962, a move that brought the world to the brink of nuclear war but also pulled it back. Without Penkovsky's information, the Cuban Missile Crisis could have ended not with diplomacy, but with nuclear fire. Yet, despite his invaluable service, Penkovsky's legacy in the West was complicated. To protect ongoing operations and other agents, his story was hushed, obscured in half-truths and silence. Some in the CIA and MI6 argued that celebrating him would expose too much, endanger too many. Others whispered that he had been reckless, that his downfall had endangered entire networks. In the end, his contributions were buried in secrecy, known only to insiders and historians who pieced the fragments together decades later. For the Soviets, his name became a cautionary tale, invoked within the KGB as the archetype of betrayal. His story served the regime's propaganda machine, a narrative of a man corrupted by Western decadence, a warning to all who dared question the state's absolute authority. But beneath the official narrative lay fear. Fear of dissent, fear of the cracks in their iron facade, fear that one man could destabilize the empire. But here lies the paradox. Oleg Penkovsky was not merely a spy who betrayed his country. He was a man who betrayed an empire to save a world. In his eyes, loyalty to humanity outweighed loyalty to a system he believed would plunge humanity into ruin. He was both traitor and hero, villain and savior, depending on which side of the Iron Curtain you stood. The echoes of his choices lingered for decades. His intelligence directly influenced the delicate balance of nuclear deterrence, shaping U.S. policy and curbing Soviet ambitions. He proved that a single double agent could alter the trajectory of global events. And though his life ended in the shadows of a prison, his impact illuminated one of the darkest chapters of the 20th century. Think about this. In an age where entire nations armed themselves with weapons capable of erasing humanity in hours, it was not armies or governments that tipped the scales. It was one man, risking everything in the name of survival for all. A man whose very existence proved that individuals could shape history in ways empires never anticipated. The curtain closed on Penkovsky's life, but the questions he raised remain alive. What does loyalty mean when governments gamble with humanity's future? Where does treason end and conscience begin? And perhaps the most haunting question of all, if the price of preventing nuclear war was his life, was it worth it? To this day, historians debate Penkovsky's true motivations. Was he driven by moral conviction, personal disillusionment with the Soviet system, or ambition for recognition in the West? Perhaps it was all three. Perhaps it doesn't matter. What matters is the outcome. His betrayal bought the world time, a fragile piece held together by secrets and shadows. And so, as the Cold War dragged on for decades after his execution, Penkovsky's ghost haunted both Washington and Moscow. In secret rooms, his intelligence was still studied, dissected, admired. In Soviet training manuals, his name remained a specter of caution. In the silence of history, he became both forgotten and unforgettable. In the end, he had defied the impossible. A lone man, armed not with weapons but with information, shook two empires and, in doing so, changed the fate of the Cold War. If the story of espionage, betrayal, and global survival gripped you, remember, there are countless more untold stories hidden in the shadows of history. What if I told you there was another spy, even more dangerous, who managed to infiltrate not just one, but two governments at the same time? Make sure you subscribe, because in the next episode, we're diving into another secret that could have changed the world forever. The Americans knew, the British knew, and most importantly, the KGB knew. The circle was closing. For our spy, daily life became unbearable. He would wake in the middle of the night, convinced that footsteps were echoing outside his door. He checked his phone line for taps he knew would be there. He tested his locks twice, 3 times before leaving his flat. He even stopped writing in his private notebooks, afraid that anything committed to paper would be found and used against him. Still, he clung to one hope: exfiltration. He begged his Western handlers to arrange an escape. A plane out of Moscow, a false passport, a car slipping across the Finnish border under cover of night. But exfiltrations were rare and dangerous. They required timing, precision, and above all, luck. Luck was something he had less and less of. In the summer of 1985, his world finally collapsed. Returning home one evening, he found 2 black Volgas parked discreetly down the street. A figure lingered at the stairwell, smoking, watching. Inside his apartment, he sensed the faint shift of air, as though someone had been there before him. The knock came at midnight. 3 sharp raps on the door. Not the hesitant knock of a neighbor, not the casual tap of a friend. This was official. This was final. He opened it to find 3 men in plain clothes. They did not shout. They did not explain. They simply informed him that he was required for questioning. He was escorted into the waiting car. The ride through Moscow was silent, the city lights passing like funeral torches. At Lubyanka prison, the beating heart of Soviet intelligence, he was stripped of his belongings and locked in a cold cell. Interrogation began the next morning. For hours, for days, for weeks, he was questioned. Who were his contacts? How long had he betrayed the motherland? What secrets had he passed? Names. They wanted names. He denied everything at first, as all spies do. But denial only buys time, and time was running out. The KGB had evidence. They showed him copies of his coded messages, photographs from surveillance, testimony from defectors. Piece by piece, the life he had built unraveled before him. The Americans were powerless. They had no diplomatic channel strong enough to rescue him. For them, he was an asset, valuable, yes, but ultimately expendable. In the brutal calculus of espionage, even the most prized informant could be sacrificed if it meant avoiding a greater risk. And so, the man who had once shaped the course of the Cold War found himself utterly alone. Abandoned by the West, condemned by the East, he had no country left to call his own. His trial was swift and secret. There was no jury, no appeal. Just a panel of judges, military uniforms heavy with medals, staring down at him with contempt. The verdict was inevitable: guilty of high treason. The sentence: death. For a moment he felt an odd calm. The fear that had consumed him for months dissolved into something else: resignation. He had always known this was how it would end. In the game of shadows, there are no happy endings. But before the executioner's bullet, he made a final request. "Tell them," he said, "that I did it for the truth, that one man can change the fate of empires." And in a way, he was right. The KGB buried the case deep in classified archives. Officially, it never happened. Unofficially, whispers persisted among intelligence officers on both sides of the Iron Curtain. Some said his information prevented nuclear war. Others claimed it prolonged the Cold War by giving the West too much confidence. The truth, like so much in espionage, was shrouded in ambiguity. But one fact remained undeniable. The double agent who had walked in the shadows for so long had finally been consumed by them. The world of espionage is one built on paranoia, and even the most skillful double agent cannot escape it forever. For years, our spy had walked a dangerous tightrope, feeding the CIA and MI6 with invaluable Soviet secrets while maintaining his image as a loyal officer of the KGB. But in the shadowy corridors of intelligence, suspicions are inevitable. Whispers become reports, reports become investigations, and investigations, if one is unlucky, end in exposure. By the late 1970s, cracks were beginning to show in the seemingly perfect cover. Some within the KGB had noticed inconsistencies in files, strange anomalies in reports, gaps in knowledge that shouldn't have existed. Nothing definitive, nothing that could be tied directly to him, but enough to raise eyebrows. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the CIA grew uneasy. His information was gold, yes, but was it too good? Was he feeding them truths to build credibility, only to one day bury a lethal falsehood? The possibility that he was a triple agent lingered, unspoken but heavy in the air. In espionage, loyalty is never absolute, and trust is always provisional. And so, he lived in a tightening vice. Mistrust from Moscow, suspicion from Washington. He was no longer a phantom in the shadows, but a man caught between two worlds, both of which could destroy him at any moment. The KGB's paranoia was relentless. In Moscow, they began reviewing cases of Western intelligence successes, dissecting every leak, every failure, every embarrassment suffered at the hands of NATO. Again and again, their analysis pointed to the same conclusion. Somewhere deep within their ranks was a traitor. Counterintelligence officers launched an operation, codenamed in whispers, never on paper, to smoke out the mole. Surveillance increased. Files were cross-checked. Travel logs were scrutinized. Every officer with access to top-tier secrets was quietly investigated. Our spy knew the walls were closing in. He could feel the eyes on him. Colleagues who once laughed with him now offered only clipped greetings. Conversations would fall silent as he entered a room. He had been trained to spot surveillance, and now he saw it everywhere. Cars that appeared on the same streets too often. Faces in the crowd that never seemed to change. A newspaper folded suspiciously on a park bench. Still, he kept his composure. He smiled when he had to, saluted when protocol demanded it, filed his reports without error. But inside, the pressure mounted. He had always lived with fear, but this was different. This was dread. Across the Iron Curtain, Western intelligence sensed the danger too. His handlers grew anxious. The signals he sent became shorter, more urgent. Meetings in safe houses were canceled at the last minute. Rendezvous in quiet cafes turned tense, silent affairs. Every second felt borrowed. One handler recalled later that he had the look of a man who knew his number was up. But still he came. Still he passed on information that shaped NATO's understanding of Soviet capabilities, troop movements, nuclear deployment strategies, the internal debates within the Kremlin leadership. He was risking his life not just out of loyalty, but because betrayal, once begun, cannot be undone. Then came the slip. It was small, almost invisible, a minor inconsistency in a coded message, perhaps the result of exhaustion or a mind clouded by fear. To most, it would have been overlooked, but to a trained counterintelligence officer, it was enough to raise alarm. The KGB quietly increased its surveillance on him. They combed through his records with renewed vigor. They tailed his movements with precision. And slowly, patterns began to emerge. Patterns that pointed toward betrayal. But the KGB was cautious. A false accusation could ruin lives and destroy careers. They needed proof. And proof, in the world of espionage, often came from betrayal of another kind. Enter Aldrich Ames, or Robert Hansen, or perhaps another. History is filled with double agents who turned the tide by betraying their counterparts. What we know is this: somewhere within the labyrinth of spies and counterspies, someone whispered his name to the wrong ear. Whether by loyalty to Moscow, greed, or sheer survival instinct, the betrayal was delivered. Through Gordievsky, MI6 and the CIA learned the extent of this program. It revealed a Soviet leadership consumed by fear, interpreting every NATO exercise, every political speech, as a potential prelude to nuclear war. For Western policymakers, it was a terrifying revelation. The world stood closer to annihilation than anyone realized. By understanding Soviet paranoia, leaders like Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan adjusted their rhetoric and military posture, easing tensions that could have erupted in catastrophic miscalculation. Every meeting, every piece of information passed, felt like a roll of the dice. In the game of espionage, death was never more than a heartbeat away. The KGB was not naive. They knew moles existed. Counterintelligence units spent countless hours monitoring their own, searching for discrepancies, for any sign of disloyalty. One slip, one misplaced document, one suspicious absence, and Gordievsky would vanish into the black hole of Lubyanka prison, never to be heard from again. There was one night he would never forget. He had just returned from a clandestine meeting with his MI6 handler. The streets of Moscow were eerily quiet, the fog clinging to the pavement like a warning. As he turned the corner to his apartment, he noticed a car idling nearby, its headlights off. His heart froze. Was this it? Had the KGB finally discovered him? He forced himself to walk past calmly, every nerve in his body screaming. The car remained still. No door opened. No one emerged. But the paranoia lingered. For hours, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every step he had taken, every glance over his shoulder. What gnawed at him most was not the thought of his own death, but the destruction of everything he had built. If he was caught, MI6 would lose its greatest asset. His family would be shattered. His children would grow up in the shadow of a traitor's legacy. The weight was unbearable, yet he pressed on, knowing the information he delivered could change the fate of nations. As his betrayal deepened, his relationship with the West evolved. MI6 regarded him with awe, but also with concern. They knew his value, but they also knew he was living on borrowed time. To protect him, they devised intricate contingency plans, escape routes, extraction protocols, signals for emergency communication. One such plan, later known as Operation Pimlico, would become legendary. It was an escape scenario so daring it seemed like a scene from a spy thriller. But for now, it remained a contingency, a plan Gordievsky prayed he would never have to use. In London, his intelligence was treated as gold. Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher herself received reports sourced directly from him. She recognized his value instantly. Thatcher, who had built a reputation as the Iron Lady, forged a personal trust in Gordievsky's intelligence. She even shared it with Ronald Reagan, shaping U.S. foreign policy at critical moments of the Cold War. Imagine the irony. A Soviet colonel sworn to protect the Kremlin was now directly influencing the decisions of the leaders sworn to oppose it. Each revelation was like a dagger into the heart of the Soviet Union. But with each dagger, Gordievsky also carved his own grave. The KGB's paranoia was escalating. They had begun to suspect there was a high-level leak. Agents were reassigned. Files were reviewed. Surveillance intensified. Gordievsky's every move was now under a microscope. And yet, he continued, because betrayal, once begun, cannot be undone. There was no turning back. Gordievsky had chosen his path, and he would walk it until the very end. As the mid-1980s approached, the noose began to tighten. Whispers in KGB corridors spoke of a traitor among them. MI6 grew increasingly alarmed, urging caution. But Gordievsky was already in too deep. He had betrayed the Soviet Empire, reshaped the course of the Cold War, and altered the destiny of nations. The only question that remained was not if he would be caught, but when. The meetings were never ordinary. They were whispers in the dark, carefully choreographed encounters in smoke-filled cafes, shadowed alleys, or the anonymity of bustling train stations where a man could blend into the crowd and disappear in seconds. For Oleg Gordievsky, each meeting represented both salvation and damnation. On one side, he was the KGB's rising star, entrusted with intelligence of immense importance. On the other, he was MI6's most valuable asset in Moscow, feeding them secrets that shifted the balance of the Cold War. The betrayal itself began in small fragments that would seem inconsequential if isolated. A memo here, an overheard conversation there. At first, he passed along tidbits, internal reports that revealed cracks in Soviet leadership, memos on political appointments, minor cables about diplomatic receptions. But as trust deepened, the scale grew exponentially. Within a few years, Gordievsky was no longer providing scraps. He was handing the West the very architecture of Soviet strategy. Every transfer of information carried a ritual. MI6 had trained him in elaborate dead-drop methods. Sometimes, he'd leave a hollowed-out book on a park bench, inside which lay a microfilm roll containing dozens of pages of Soviet plans. Other times, he'd drop a coded chalk mark on a lamppost to signal a completed delivery. The British handlers, cloaked as businessmen or cultural attaches, would retrieve the material within hours. In the world of espionage, timing was life, and MI6 realized quickly what they had stumbled upon. This was not another mid-level informant, feeding embellished tales to feel important. This was the crown jewel. Gordievsky had access to Politburo directives, to KGB operational orders, to the very heartbeat of the Soviet machine. Each piece of intelligence he delivered was like oxygen for Western leaders suffocating in the fog of Cold War uncertainty. One of his earliest breakthroughs involved the Soviet Union's perception of NATO's intentions. In the early 1980s, tensions between East and West had reached apocalyptic levels. NATO had launched large-scale military exercises, and the Kremlin truly believed, that these might be a cover for a nuclear first strike. Through Gordievsky, MI6 learned just how paranoid Moscow had become. The Soviets were preparing to launch preemptive strikes based on faulty assumptions. It was information that shocked London and Washington. Without Gordievsky's revelations, the world might have stumbled into nuclear war through sheer miscalculation. But these triumphs came with a cost. Living a double life was suffocating. Gordievsky walked through Moscow every day wearing a mask so convincing that even his closest colleagues believed in his loyalty. By night, he was the West's most valuable double agent. By day, he was the embodiment of Soviet patriotism, quoting Lenin, executing orders, attending meetings with an air of calculated devotion. His wife noticed changes, of course. Oleg had always been disciplined, but now there were moments of distraction. Times when he would sit silently staring into the void, his mind far away. The lies grew heavier. She had no idea that their marriage, their home, their children's safety, all of it, was balanced on the edge of a knife. The deeper he went, the higher the stakes became. MI6 pressed him for more, and he delivered. He exposed KGB recruitment strategies, disinformation campaigns, the vast web of agents embedded in Europe. He revealed Soviet plans to destabilize Western governments from within, using front organizations, propaganda, and carefully orchestrated chaos. It was intelligence that reshaped Western counterintelligence strategies, allowing them to dismantle operations that had been running for years under the radar. But the greatest moment of betrayal, the moment that cemented his place in the history of espionage, came when Gordievsky exposed Operation Ryan. This was the KGB's most secretive and most dangerous program, a paranoid hunt for signs that NATO was preparing a nuclear strike. The Soviets had tasked thousands of officers worldwide to gather intelligence, from tracking military flights to monitoring power plants in Europe. The mission was simple: detect the West's first strike before it happened, so the USSR could launch its missiles first. He convinced himself he was being watched even when he wasn't. And in a sense, he was right, for the machinery of counterintelligence is vast, relentless, and patient. It may not have identified him yet, but the net was always out there, waiting. Still, the documents he passed on made their way into the hands of Western policymakers, shaping decisions at the highest level. NATO strategies, American diplomatic cables, even the timing of military exercises, all were influenced by the tiny pieces of paper he risked everything to provide. Unbeknownst to him, generals in Washington and London were whispering his code name, debating whether his information was too good to be true. If this source is real, one report stated bluntly, he could change the trajectory of the Cold War. But he was not motivated solely by ideology or money. What gnawed at him was the hypocrisy he witnessed inside the empire he served. He saw leaders preach sacrifice while hoarding luxuries, generals boasting of strength while sending ill-equipped soldiers to parade for foreign dignitaries, ministers denouncing decadence while indulging in private parties with caviar and champagne. It was not just betrayal of state secrets, it was, in his mind, betrayal of a lie. And in that contradiction, he justified himself. "I am not the traitor," he would whisper to his reflection in the bathroom mirror. "They are." The Western intelligence services, for their part, were cautious. They knew the fate of double agents too well. A single misstep could expose him, and exposure meant torture, trial, execution. They urged patience, discipline. They instructed him never to take unnecessary risks, never to be a hero. But the appetite for information is insatiable. Each successful delivery made the handlers ask for more. Each new document widened their hunger. And slowly, the weight pressed down upon him. Could he keep up the charade forever? One night, while attending a state reception, he caught sight of a man across the room who made his stomach clench. It was a colonel from counterintelligence, a man known for his brutal interrogations. For a split second, their eyes met, and our spy felt certain the man could see through him, could read his guilt as plainly as the tie he wore. He forced himself to raise a glass, to smile, to act natural. But the sensation lingered. The walls were closing in. Despite the fear, his position continued to rise. He became known as a reliable officer, diligent, disciplined, loyal, or so they thought. Ironically, his skill at deception made him a model citizen in the eyes of his superiors. The more he betrayed, the more they trusted him. And with that trust came access to even greater secrets. Discussions of nuclear deployments, the positioning of submarines, the details of missile development. These were not just papers. These were potential triggers of global annihilation. The tension escalated when he was tasked with preparing reports on Western diplomatic strategies. He realized, with a chill, that he was now writing documents for the very leaders he was betraying, documents that he himself would later smuggle out in coded form to his handlers. He was both author and thief, fabricating loyalty while feeding the enemy. It was a psychological torment, and yet also a perverse thrill. In some way, he had become addicted to the game. Late at night, he began to wonder, who was he really serving? Was it the West, who praised him in whispers and rewarded him with gifts? Was it himself clinging to the illusion of freedom through betrayal? Or was it no one at all? Was he simply an actor in a theater of lies? His life nothing more than a play staged by two empires? As the months bled into years, his world narrowed into this paradox. Every handshake could be a trap. Every smile could conceal suspicion. And yet, he could not stop. He was too deep. He was too valuable. He was too compromised. One winter evening, as snow fell over the city and muffled the sounds of traffic, he returned from a dead drop trembling with both relief and dread. He had just delivered one of the most sensitive documents of his career, a classified briefing on nuclear warhead deployment in Eastern Europe. He knew with absolute certainty that if this file was traced to him, his life would end in a basement interrogation room, unmarked and unremembered. But as he stood by the frosted window of his apartment, staring at the shadows stretching across the icy street, he realized there was no turning back. He had chosen this path. He would see it through to the end, no matter where it led. The die was cast. The young man who had once seemed destined for a quiet life as a scholar of languages and history was now walking on a razor's edge between two worlds. By day, he moved confidently through the corridors of the state, rubbing shoulders with diplomats, generals, and high-ranking party officials. By night, he stared at ceiling cracks in his small apartment, consumed by the secret knowledge that he was playing both sides of the Cold War. He was no longer simply a functionary. He was an asset, a double agent feeding information that could alter the balance of power between East and West. The transition had not been immediate. It had begun with subtle signals, careful touches. A glance exchanged with a supposed cultural attaché at a reception. A book discreetly slipped into his hands with a folded note tucked inside. And then the meetings began. At first, he was terrified. Every step to the park bench felt like a march toward execution. He would imagine the eyes of the secret police watching him from behind every newspaper stand, every apartment window. Yet somehow no one stopped him. No one asked questions. It was as though the world conspired to protect his treachery. The Western handler who first approached him had an unremarkable face. Gray suit, thinning hair, spectacles smudged with fingerprints. He looked like a bureaucrat lost in the wrong building. But his voice was calm, steady, and confident, carrying the weight of countless operations before this one. "You have access," the man said in accented Russian, his tone as even as if he were discussing the weather. "Access to things that matter. You can be of service not just to us, but to history." At first, our spy resisted. He insisted he was no traitor. He told himself he was just curious, that he was meeting out of academic interest, that he wanted to hear how the West perceived the world. But then came the promises. Money, yes, but more than that. Books banned in his homeland, rare recordings of Western symphonies, the possibility of travel, even the quiet suggestion of asylum if things grew too dangerous. And slowly, his conscience began to erode. He began to ask himself, was loyalty to a system that suffocated truth and individuality truly loyalty at all? The first package he handed over was small, almost meaningless. A set of internal memos detailing the logistics of a regional military exercise. But when his handler accepted it with grave seriousness, he realized the value of even the tiniest piece of information. "One document," the handler said, "can be more powerful than an army division if it lands in the right hands." That night, as he lay awake listening to the hum of the radiator, he understood. He had crossed a line from which there was no return. His double life grew more elaborate with each passing month. He learned to adopt the art of compartmentalization, to move through banquets and official briefings as though he had no secret at all. He trained himself to laugh at the appropriate jokes, to salute at the right moments, to play the loyal servant. Yet every smile concealed a dagger. Every toast was a mask hiding betrayal. He was both patriot and traitor, hero and villain, depending on who told the story. Soon, he was entrusted with more sensitive files, internal policy drafts, records of conversations between party leaders, assessments of foreign ambassadors. His handlers were delighted. What began as fragments now became a mosaic, a portrait of the empire's thinking at its highest levels. And in return, he received not only praise but also techniques, tools, the subtle education of a man becoming a professional spy. They taught him how to leave chalk marks on lampposts to signal meetings, how to use a matchbox filled with microfilm, how to create dead drops in hollowed-out tree trunks or behind loose bricks and walls. He memorized sequences of numbers that translated into entire paragraphs through ciphers. He practiced the art of counter-surveillance, taking long, meandering routes through the city, doubling back across bridges, stepping suddenly into bookstores to see if anyone followed. He became a shadow of himself, a man whose true identity only emerged when the world was looking away. Yet with each act of treachery came a tightening in his chest. He could never truly relax. Every knock at the door could be his last. Every official letterhead could conceal his death sentence. He grew paranoid, scanning faces on the subway, listening to footsteps behind him.